Greetings fellow Mist Wanderers, my name is Steve Morgan and this is DM of the Mists covering all things Curse of Strahd and Ravenloft. My last video before this was an epic, nearly hour and a half long version of my experience running the domain of Valachan, the Deadly Jungle. So I'm kind of looking forward to doing some shorter videos now. I've done one NPC video before where I talked about Jan the Sunstar, the good vampire, who's more of a Ravenloft NPC than a Curse of Strahd NPC, although there are some DMs who include him in Curse of Strahd because his backstory in the novel that he was in Barovia and met Strahd. And this time, however, I'm going to cover my probably second favourite Ravenloft NPC and my favourite Curse of Strahd NPC, Ezmerelda, also known as Ez Davenier, protégé of Van Richten, Rudolph van Richten, and the Monster Hunter. And Ez is, as well as being in Curse of Strahd, she appears in Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft as well, so she could be used in either Curse of Strahd, which is what I did, because I did Curse of Strahd before moving on to a wider Ravenloft campaign, or if you're not doing Curse of Strahd, you can introduce her somewhere, whether it's in Barovia, if that's a pit stop on the campaign, or elsewhere. I'm probably going to mostly be talking about how she appears in Curse of Strahd, because that's where she appears mostly, and that's how I ran her and know her best. Let's talk about resources and where you can find lore and information on her. So the two obvious likely places are Curse of Strahd and Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. An interesting note about these two sources is that Ez's backstory was tweaked slightly. So in Curse of Strahd, she was the daughter of some Vistani who were criminals, essentially. However, they changed it in Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. Her parents were bandits who pretended to be Vistani, but then she later joined the Vistani band. So she did sort of become a Vistani rather than being born into being a Vistani. I started running Curse of Strahd for my group in 2020. Van Richten's Guide came out in 2021, and I had introduced Ez before this sort of mini-retcon happened in Van Richten's Guide. So as far as my players were concerned, she was Vistani. I can't remember if they learnt about her past and her parents and all that, but I ran that version essentially. Another thing I should mention as well, so in Van Richten's Guide, in the Mist Wanderer section, it talks about Ez. And in Curse of Strahd, she's got a whole appendix section dedicated to her. She appears 4 times, sort of by default. I guess you could have her appear wherever you want. But in the book, she appears 4 times, 4 possible places. Now, if I remember them all correctly off the top of my head, she's found at the Abbey and Kresk sort of as standard. That's where you kind of see her waiting in a room. And the other times are either events or random encounters. There's in Castle Ravenloft, there's a random encounter. There's an event at Van Richten's Tower, and there's an event at Argynbostholt. So if you're reading up about Ez in Curse of Strahd and Van Richten's Guide, and in Curse of Strahd especially, it might be worth looking at those 4 chapters and just reading about her information there, because you might be able to glean a few extra things about her from there. There's 2 other guides that I like. I wouldn't say I followed them super closely, but I'd still recommend them. They're still good people, still good guides, worth having a look. And then sort of what I do is I tend to take piecemeal. So if I wouldn't necessarily go to a guide and run it exactly as they say, but I'll take the bits that I like, and you might want to do that here. One of them is Notes on Ezmerelda, and that's by a Reddit user called Guild's Bounty. Now, Guild's Bounty did a Reddit article about Strahd, and I think it's called something like My Notes on Running Strahd as an Unholy Terror, and that is excellent. I followed that closely. And then it was also done Ezmerelda, and I think possibly a few other Curse of Strahd NPCs as well. Mandy Mod admits that she uses a lot of Guild's Bounty stuff, but also adds to it as well, so you might want to take a look at that as well. Mandy Mod, if you're not familiar, is one of the popular modification guides and gives extra lore and information and possible changes to the campaign. Her guide is great. Another thing I'd like to address before I move on is there's an interesting contradiction in Curse of Strahd between the backstory of Ez and the backstory of Van Richten. And I've seen a fair few Reddit posts about this. So in Ezmerelda's version of events, after what happened with Erasmus and Baron Metis, if you've read that in the book, Erasmus is essentially kidnapped by Ezmerelda's parents, whether you consider them as Vistani or people masquerading as Vistani, given to the vampire Baron Metis, and is turned into a vampire, and Van Richten has to defeat them both. And in Ezmerelda's version of events, Van Richten was obviously upset with Ez's family, but spared their lives, showed mercy. In Van Richten's version of events, he sought revenge, and he got revenge. He bumped into a lich, who I think people speculate is Aslan Rex from Darkon, and this, I think, would have all taken place in Darkon. And he is basically given zombies, as you do. A lich comes along and says, hey, have some zombies, free of charge. Van Richten then essentially sets the zombies on the Vistani group and kills them all, and then is cursed. There's a whole thing about how he's cursed, that all the people he loves, if he gets close to people, they'll die. A lot of people have picked up on this discrepancy, and some people say, oh, maybe Ez's version is true, he's spared them and showed mercy. Maybe Van Richten's version is true and they all died. I kind of like, there was somebody who said, and I can't find the source for this unfortunately, I did look at a few of the old posts when I was researching this video and tried to find the one in particular. But one I liked is one person said, what if they're both true? True in the sense that it's what the people believe. And so Ez believes that her family got spared, or her Vistani group got spared, and Van Richten did actually kill some Vistani with some zombies. And the way this could work, I guess, is say if Ez and her parents were spared and then they left, and then Van Richten used the zombies to kill that sort of group of people. So that would mean both are sort of true, or at least Ez would think it's true, that he was merciful. There's interesting as well, and sage advice, there's a tweet from Chris Perkins where somebody asked him about this and he said, well, one of them's a lie, but he doesn't say which, which is one of those annoying things of like, come on man, you can just tell us. And I think he's done that on purpose so that people can sort of try and guess which is the lie, or one person might run the story where Ez is lying, one person might run the story where Van Richten's lying. I think a few people say, and this is what I think, is that Van Richten's the one who's lying, especially because it's in his journal in the sort of back of the book. You know, it'd be a bit weird if they were lying in the appendix write-ups for them, but the journal is supposed to be what he's written, and what if he lied in what he wrote himself? What if he didn't do that? But then I guess that kind of complicates the things of would he still being cursed? I don't know. Anyway, that's enough about sort of lore and where you can find information on Ez. Let's move on to roleplay. So bear with me here. This is going to sound a bit weird first of all, but it'll make sense as I explain it. When I was a teenager, obviously growing up with a lot of comedy shows, big fan of all sorts of things from Arrested Development to Community. Cheers is one of my favourite shows of all time. When I was a teenager, I used to watch a lot of MASH, the Korean War comedy with the surgeons. And what I really liked about the characters in MASH is they were off-duty, they were silly, they were jokey, they would prank each other, they were good friends, well, most of them. They, you know, and there's obviously people who say that they did that because it kind of distracted them from the horrors of war, which makes sense. But when, say, the helicopter arrives for someone who's injured, they just go straight to business. It's no jokes, no silliness, they just do all they can to save this person's life. And I like to play Ezmerelda in that way. So the way I played her was out of combat, she was quite friendly, she was quite jokey, and this was a good sort of contrast to the brooding, mysterious Van Richten, maybe not in his Octavio persona, but in his regular persona, and I'll discuss their kind of relationship in a minute. But yes, a kind of jokey, friendly out of combat, but when combat happens, she's deadly serious, you know, stern expression, no longer the smiles and the joking, whips out her weapons and goes to town, essentially. In my game, and I'll talk more about how things happened in my game later on, Van Richten was drawn as the fated ally in Madame Eva's Tarocca reading, and then Ez kind of joined around for a bit once they kind of found him and he joined them. And I wouldn't sort of act this all out because I think it would have been a bit sort of taken away from the players, but I would try to get the point across to the players that they would argue a lot, Ez and Van Richten. She has a very chaotic nature. If you look at their stat block, she's chaotic good and he's lawful good. And what I like about them is, even though he's the mentor to Ez, I like to think as Van Richten as the sort of careful planning one, especially because he's an old man now. He knows he's not as strong as or as fit as he used to be. So he would be the kind of person who, if he's thinking, right, I'm going to take down Strahd, he literally spends, if you read in the book, he spends months planning and scheming how to defeat him. Ez strikes me as the kind of person who would just kick a door down and be like, right, I'm here to kill some vamps. And would be the complete opposite of Van Richten in that regard. Not silly or reckless to the point where she's not stupid, she's, you know, smart, but she would act more on kind of a chaotic instinct in nature than, say, Van Richten, probably taking it to the extreme with being someone who schemes and plans and things like that. And they are both, Ez and Van Richten are essentially, well, I used to call Van Richten like a walking monster manual. Any monster they saw, he could advise the players, the PCs, this is so-and-so. Don't use this type of magic for it. Make sure you use your magic weapons. It's weak against this kind of magic, blah, blah, blah. Now, for Ez, I did something similar, but I still rolled history checks for her, and then kind of set a low DC, unless it was something really unusual, to identify the monsters and say, if she got a 10, she'd probably recognise what it is. If she got a 15, she'd be able to say, oh, it's this thing and maybe say one weakness or one thing to watch out for. And if she got, say, over a 20, she'd be like, she knows everything about it and she can relay that to the players, or she can relay it to the characters, and you as a DM can relay it to the players. Sort of fitting with the whole sort of jokey nature I talked about a minute ago. If you saw a video I put out a few months ago where I talk about sort of funny moments in Curse of Strahd, where I also share a few stories of my own, I had this incident where that I called the story of Abs when she's found in Kresg. I played it a little differently, so they met her at Van Richten's tower, but I played it, she had been at Kresg before, so she already knew people like the abbot and some of the mongrel folk. So when they go to Kresg later on with Ez and she sees the abbot again, she jokingly calls him Abs, and she jokes with the players, oh, I do that because I reckon, you know, this sort of dorky holy man has the cracking bod under those robes. And then later on, when he's revealed to be a Deva, and you see the art for a Deva in the monster manual, she's like, oh my god, he does have abs, which was quite a funny moment. But I also played her, so she'll do silly things like that, say silly things like that, but I also played her as very serious when it comes to sort of, I don't know how to describe this, moral compass type stuff. So when my players decided to attack the abbot and Basilica because they got the wedding dress for him, but then he wanted them to also give him Irina, and this completely freaked out my players because they liked Irina and they didn't like what he had in mind for her and why he was asking for her. So they attacked the abbot, and then there was this full-scale battle. My players never realised this, but Cloven, in the background while the battle was going on, ran and alerted all the other mongrel folk to attack. And during the battle, Ezmerelda was obviously fighting as well, and I had Otto and Siegfried, who were the two named, I think they're found like near the entrance. And I had it that when Ez arrived at the Abbey previously, she had a good relationship with these mongrel folk and was friends with them. So during the battle, they were saying, Ezmerelda, what's going on? What are you doing? Why are you fighting us? And then at the end, after the battle, and obviously you've got the people of Kresg to thank for, I think a were-raven or two helped out and they were like, well done, and then just flew off. But Ez wasn't happy. She's just sat like on her own, and then when the PCs were like, are you okay, Ez? She's like, no, these weren't monsters. These weren't mindless monsters. These were people. They were defending their home, and we had no choice but to fight them back and kill them, and some of them were my friends. And kind of there's a moment of reflection where the players, I hope they were thinking, oh gosh, like, what have we done? That classic thing of, are we the baddies? Are we the monsters? Which seems to be a kind of common theme in Curse of Strahd and Ravenloft and things like that. Okay, let's talk about the stat block. Her stat block is amazing, and I did a Reddit post talking about how to run her optimally in combat. For those of you who are fans of The Monsters Know What They're Doing, and he covers obviously everything in the Monster Manual, various other books. He has done Van Richten's Guide Monsters as well, I believe, but he doesn't go to the effort of monsters unique to a source book, I don't think, or other source books, or adventures. So I don't think he's done people like Strahd. It'd be amazing to see his take on Strahd. But that means he's not really done Ezmerelda. So I kind of took the liberty to have a go myself. And in that post on Reddit, I'm going to put it over here in case you see me looking over here. I start off by saying I was a player in Curse of Strahd before DMing it, and my DM in that campaign asked the players to run NPC allies for him to take the sort of load off, the DM load off him. And at one point I was given Ezmerelda when we were in Castle Ravenloft, and I'd never played a magic caster before. My first PC was just a fighter. So I was like, oh, spells. And I probably just didn't run her optimally. I think I just did a couple of lightning bolts and that was it. But when I ran Curse of Strahd for myself and I was researching her stat block ahead of my players meeting her and her tagging along for a bit, I was really impressed by what's in her stat block. She's got a good offense, defense, support, you name it. So I'm going to quickly kind of run through all the stuff she's got and all the stuff she can do, and in certain scenarios she might use certain types of weapons or certain types of spells, that kind of thing. So her offense, she can do various melee attacks. She can do 3 attacks with her various weapons, assuming she uses her offhand weapon as well. She can use her rapier twice, her magical rapier, and then she's got a choice between a silvered short sword, and a magical hand axe. Her stats are better with the silver short sword, but I would argue that if she knew she was fighting something that didn't have any magical resistance or immunities, I believe Vampire Spawn, let me double check. Yes, Vampire Spawn have resistance to non-magical attacks, whereas with werewolves, silvered weapons can still be used. Well, that's immunity altogether, so that's a whole other kettle of fish. But with Vampire Spawn, silvered weapons are just like a regular weapon against them. So if she was, say, fighting something that she knows doesn't have any resistances, she'd use a short sword because she knows she's better, more capable with that. But if she's up against, say, something like a Vampire Spawn, and she knows about their resistances, if she rolled a good roll on that history check I talked about earlier, she would use the hand axe. That's slightly less chance of hit, but she knows that that's going to do more damage if it does. And then of course she's got some ranged attacks she can use, such as Firebolt, her cantrip. She can use Lightning Bolt, Magic Missile for various things. If a few people are lined up, like she used, like in my game, she used Lightning Bolt reluctantly in the Mongrel Folk battle, and that probably took out a few just in one hit. In terms of defense, she has four words: Mirror, Image, and Shield. Now she already has a high AC because she wears magical armor and has a good dex score, so she's got an AC of 17. The spell Shield is a reaction. If somebody gets higher than a 17 but lower than a 22, she can use her reaction to cast Shield, and the attack misses, and then it's active until the start of her turn. So up until, from that inactive until the start of her turn, her AC goes up to 22. Now that's higher than Strahd's animated armor that has an AC of 21. That's wild. That's amazing. So she would probably use that in order to defend herself. She can always use Mirror Image. If you're not familiar with that spell, you kind of have 3 reflections yourself appear, and then if someone targets her, you roll a d20, and the more reflections there are, the more chance they hit a reflection, and then their AC is quite low. It still has a AC of 14, because it's 10 plus your dex score. But yeah, so it means then there's chances that people will hit when they attack, and they do hit, they don't actually hit her, they hit a reflection. She also can cast Greater Invisibility, so if she gets really overwhelmed or really desperate, she could cast that and maybe retreat or attack with advantage. Now, the funny thing is Greater Invisibility requires concentration, but Mirror Image doesn't. She could even cast both of them at the same time, making her almost impossible to hit. If instead of Greater Invisibility, she were to cast a different concentration spell, she could cast Protection from Evil and Good and cast it against, say, if she's fighting a ton of undead, cast it on herself, Protection from Undead, and they all have disadvantage against her. And that lasts longer as well. Greater Invisibility, Mirror Image each last a minute. Protection from Evil and Good lasts 10 minutes, so it can last for a lot. If it's a longer battle or it's lots of small battles in succession, it makes sense that she would cast that. So because she's a Vistana as well, whether you use the lore in Curse of Strahd that says she was born a Vistana, or the lore in Van Richten's Guide that says she becomes sort of like an honorary Vistana, she joins the Vistani group and they take her in. She has 2 abilities on stat block called Curse and Evil Eye. Now I've talked about this on another video. I can understand if people don't want to use these abilities. I think they haven't necessarily been retconned, but in Curse of Strahd Errata and sort of Van Richten's Guide changes, Wizards of the Coast have kind of realised that these people are based on a real life group of people. People may find that insensitive. So if you don't want to use Curse and Evil Eye, just ignore this part of the video, jump ahead. But if you do use Curse and Evil Eye, well, Curse means that she can grant a damage type of her choice on somebody. So imagine if she uses Radiant damage on a vampire spawn or Strahd. That could be pretty brutal. And Evil Eye allows her to cast, in addition to her already decent list of spells, Animal Friendship, Charm Person, and Hold Person once per short or long rest, on top of all of her other spells. Now, let's not forget as well, Hold Person can only target, and Charm Person can only target humanoids. So it wouldn't work on Strahd because he's undead, but it would work on a werewolf. And it would also work on Babala Saga. Casting Hold Person on Babala Saga could be pretty brutal. It's a difficult one because you want to play the NPC allies optimally, but you also want your enemies, your villains, to have satisfying battles. So if you then have Ezmerelda cast Hold Person on Babala Saga and it makes a trivial battle, I can kind of think it's one of those situations where you think, actually, let's not have Ez cast that so that they have a bit of a challenge. Or if things get really ugly and Babala Saga looks like she's going to TPK the party, that's when Ezmerelda brings out the big guns and tries to cast Hold Person. She has a bunch of other spells as well, such as Knock, Clairvoyance, Magic Circle. Magic Circle, I think I've seen people make the mistake of thinking it's instant, but it takes a minute to cast. That's 10 rounds. But that can be, under certain situations, that can be good. And some handy cantrips as well, like Light, Mage Hand, and Prestidigitation. I can never pronounce that. Prestidigitation, that'll do. She also has some healing potions in her inventory, and some wooden stakes and some other stuff. And let's not forget her wagon outside Van Richten's chat tower, assuming it's not been blown up, contains a whole other bunch of goodies, extra weapons, extra supplies as well. But I would argue that in addition to everything I've just said, one of Ez's greatest strengths is probably her, and I touched upon this earlier, her knowledge of monsters. So in addition to being great at attack, great at defense, great at support, having some handy items and weapons, she can also help the players to know how to tackle certain monsters. So yes, she is a beast. She's a lot of fun to run in combat, and which I'll talk about in a bit, some of the stuff she's done in my game. So in my Curse of Strahd / wider Ravenloft campaign, we'll start with the Curse of Strahd stuff first, obviously, because it was the first part of it. As mentioned earlier, Van Richten was a fated ally, and he was unmasked at Van Richten's tower later on after various things happened in Vallaki. Long story, but he essentially got spooked from Vallaki before the festival, which meant that the Tiger event didn't happen. So he retreated to the tower. They saw him at the tower. He revealed himself to them, and he believed them when they said, oh, this Vistani magic, this card reading said that you would help us. And I played it that he knew Madame Eva by reputation, and he believed that if that's the case, then I've got to help you fight Strahd and we'll take Strahd down together. And as they all went to leave the tower, Ezmerelda comes. I played the event from, I think it's called Ezmerelda's Retreat in the tower. She's been badly hurt. She's stolen a horse from the Vistani camp, and she's like, who the heck are you guys and what are you doing in my tower? Which confused them because they knew it was the tower that Van Richten was using, and he said, Esme? He then revealed himself to her as well. She's like, Van Richten, I've been looking for you. So before Van Richten's guide came out and said Ez is short for Ezmerelda, I had Van Richten give her the pet name Esme. And my characters still call her Esme for short now, years later as well, which is kind of cute. However, as I mentioned earlier, I played it that she'd already been to Krezk before. So if they'd gone to Krezk before doing Van Richten's tower, they would have seen her there as it's kind of written. But they saw her at the tower, so she'd been to Krezk, she tried to fight Strahd at Castle Ravenloft and failed, and then went to the tower. I kind of treated her as a drop-in, drop-out NPC, especially because she wasn't a fated ally. If she was a fated ally, she would stay with them no matter what. So she would say she could do reconnaissance or check out other things for them, so she could sort of disappear off every now and again. Because having, obviously, a lot of my players were fairly new and experienced, not very combat savvy, so having Van Richten, who I kind of treated more as kind of a support and healing type person, but having him and Ezmerelda was quite excessive. So there were times where I kind of just had Ez drop in and drop out. A good example was when they had the invitation for the dinner to see Strahd. I had it that she was like, I'm probably not welcome, because the last time I saw Strahd, I was firing spells at him. So I'll sit this one out. So they kind of went without Ezmerelda. She joined them for various things. I'm trying to remember things like the werewolf den, Argynvostholt, I believe. And then for the battle against Strahd in Castle Ravenloft. And then she stayed in Barovia. I took this straight out of the epilogue. They knew there was still some evil around. They hadn't done Berez, so Babylon Saga was still on the loose. That's quite interesting to run in a post-Strahd Barovia. And she just, I kind of think she wanted to settle down and... No, not settle down, because Vistani, I get the impression, always like to be sort of on the move. They don't like to stay in one place for too long, but I think she felt that something wasn't right and there were still things to do in Barovia. So I had it that she stayed in Barovia, and then they had a base. Long story short, they looked around the Watchtower House after, I can't remember if it was one time when they visited, because they were looking for the tome, or maybe later on after the Watchters were defeated, or Lady Watcher was defeated, and they came across the deeds for various bits of land. Now, Curse of Strahd doesn't tell you where these bits of land are, and I think I asked on Reddit, and somebody said it could be the Fidotov Manor out of Krezk, which I think was from an old adventure, and then there's also the Mandy mod talks about it. And I kind of like the idea that this old ruined forgotten manor just outside Krezk could be something they do up and they have it as a base, and that's what they have done. And various people on their post-Curse of Strahd, post-Brewery Adventures have moved in there. So it's kind of this ever-growing mini community of people, and Ezmerelda's kind of almost like the boss there when the adventure is off elsewhere. When they're in Barovia, Ez travels with them, and she helped them with Berez, the Amber Temple, which they also didn't do. And then I had this whole thing where Babylon Saga was found not in Berez, but in Castle Ravenloft, and the battle with her was in the Castle Ravenloft crypts, and she helped them with all that. And she also helped them give information about the Domains of Dread in a whole, and what places were like, and various NPCs. So, for example, I did this whole thing, and I did a DM's Guild resource called the Second Tarokka Reading, where the players had another Tarokka reading like the one from Madame Eva, where instead of items and an ally in Barovia, it's magic items and a fated ally spread out all the Domains of Dread. And the clue they were trying to figure out, so there's something about a carnival, something about a lighthouse, and something about a woman who's a druid who's one of twins. And she told them about the carnival, she told them the lighthouse was probably in the Sea of Sorrows, and the druidic twin, she said, well, I know some twins. The Weathermaid Foxgrove twins, and one of them's a druid, so that must be them. They're in Mordant, go check them out. So it was handy having Ez being, she could kind of be their guide for post-Curse of Strahd adventures. She could say, these places sound familiar, these are the places you need to go. So that was really handy. And then a couple of visits to back to Barovia. They've not really faced other evil, but I do have further plans. Evil DM laugh. So they helped Casimir revive, or resurrect I should say, Petrina, his sister. And his sister is slowly gathering resources, slowly biding her time, and when the moment is right, she is going to invite the PCs and other people, probably like the heads of each place, so Ismark in the village of Barovia, the people running Vallaki these days, because both the Baron and Lady Watched died, the Kresgovs from Kresk, all these kinds of people to come to the castle, and she's going to, it's essentially her coronation. She's going to say, I'm the new leader of Barovia, instead of Strahd, and then she's going to try and activate the vampire gift from Amber Temple, and she will be whereas you had Strahd, who is a spellcaster vampire, she's a vampire archmage, so a vampire with archmage spells, so even stronger than Strahd was. So she will go along for that and help them with that. My plans for my current campaign. So they've done a bunch of domains. I'll list off a few. Forkovnia, Sea of Sorrows, Demonliu. They've just done Valachan. And we've got Forlorn they've just arrived into as I record this. Probably going to do Haslan. The end game is going to be Darkon. And my BBEG is going to be Azalin and Rex. I'll talk more about that when I do the Faran Zarhonen video, which will be probably the next video after this one. And when they defeat Azalin and they celebrate, probably in some tavern, random tavern in Darkon somewhere, Ez will arrive. Now they'll know that Ez, who's always said to them, I'll always stay in Barovia. And I'm going to have her say just 5 words. Guys, it's Strahd. He's back. And if my players want to continue, then our tier 4 adventures, sort of level 15, 16 onwards, they'll have to go back to Barovia, fight Strahd. We didn't do all the Fanes of Barovia, Ladies 3 stuff in my initial run, but then they will do that. They'll learn about that and do that and defeat Strahd and Vampire for good. So, and then she'll help them with that as well, obviously. And that wraps up my sort of take on Ezmerelda. I hope you found it useful. I briefly mentioned the second Tarokka reading resource earlier when I was talking about Ez helping them find out various information about the Domains of Dread. Feel free to check that out on DM's Guild. It's if you're thinking of running a sequel to a wider Ravenloft Domain of Dread, Domain Hopping campaign is a sequel to Curse of Strahd. It should be able to help you with that. I've also created, if you're watching this really early on in running Curse of Strahd or you've not run Curse of Strahd yet, I've also created another DM's Guild resource called the 3-part Tarokka technique, where instead of rigging the Tarokka reading or having it random like in the book, you can kind of semi-control where the items end up. They're spread out in a way that's good story-wise, and things like you have the tome early on, probably somewhere around Vallaki, you get the Sun Sword really late on, like Bereza the Amber Temple, and stuff like that. So you don't have a disappointing situation where if you were to do it random, you get the Sun Sword straight away, they don't get the tome for ages, but it means that you don't have to rig it either. A nice sort of in-between, or at least I'd like to think. So as mentioned, my next video will probably be covering Faran Zarhonen, one of the Miss Wanderers covered in Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. The Archmage, my characters were introduced to him by Madame Eva in Barovia after Strahd's defeat. And he wanted to explore, he's got an interest in Amber Vestiges, so he wants to explore the Amber Temple, which is Amber Vestige Central. And they are, my players don't know this yet, but they're going to bump into him in Haslan, because he can't learn new spells. It's like a mini curse he has, and I'll talk more about this in the video. I don't want to ruin this reason why. If people know their Ravenloft history, they'll probably know the reason why. If you know, you know. But he is going to go to Haslan, because he's learned the Dark Lord of Haslan, Haslik. He can't learn spells either, so he wants to go to him, meet him, compare notes, see if they can figure this out together. And then the players will help him take down Haslik, because Haslik won't let them leave the domain. And then they will probably go back to Barovia as a collective and decide what to do about this new Lich, Darkulus Rex, who's causing chaos and havoc in Darkon, and that will trigger the endgame. And at Curse of Strahd wise, I want to do videos on when to introduce Strahd for the first time. There's 2 places I think that work really well, and I'll talk about the pros and cons of those and other things you can consider. I'm drawing a blank, and my notes are on my phone, which I record these videos with, so I don't want to be messing around with my phone right at the end of the video. But yeah. There's a whole playlist of Curse of Strahd videos, playlist of Ravenloft videos. If you want to see all my old Curse of Strahd videos and any new ones that get added to it, feel free to do that. And the classic YouTube thing, please like, please subscribe and all that jazz. I do these videos because I really enjoyed Curse of Strahd and Ravenloft, and I hope I can help out fellow DMs, because so many DMs on various Curse of Strahd and Ravenloft communities such as Reddit and Facebook have helped me out. I just want to repay the favour. And we'll leave it there. Thank you, Miss Wanderers.